Yeah, I've started the recording, and I'll just do a couple of housekeeping bits, and then Sarah, you can take it away.
Okay.
So thanks, Hillary, for the welcome. My name's Mark Leggett, and I also like to welcome everybody who's signing in for the call. Today's webinar is to highlight the efforts of the COVID-19 Working Group through RDA. So Sarah Jones and Priyanka Pillai will both present the session. If you have questions, I would encourage you to use the Q&A rather than the chat. The chat tends to get backed up with comments and other items, so it's much easier for us to handle the questions if you type them into the Q&A. So that would be the primary suggestion for today's webinar if you do have something that you wish to say. Otherwise, everybody is, except for the panelists, they're muted. And I would also remind people that we will be recording the webinar, so it will be available later today, soon after the session is done. So I am going to pass it over to Sarah.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. So thanks again to everybody for joining this. And really what we're wanting to do in this webinar is give an introduction to the COVID-19 Working Group, and really just to help you know how to contribute and get started with us. Okay, so I'll just advance this first slide here. So what we're going to present is a kind of background of how this group got set up, some aims of the group. So we've pulled together a case statement, which is the usual RDA way of kind of establishing a group, and that's already online. So you can look at the case statement, and what we'll do in this webinar is to walk through that. So to talk about the aims of the group, what outputs we're going to deliver. And because of the interest in this group, we've already got, I think, 400 members just over the last few days. We've divided the work into a series of subgroups. So we're going to talk through those 5 subgroups and then how we're actually going to do the work within those groups. So the structure that we've put forward for the recommendations and our basic timeline and ways of working. And I don't think we'll take too long presenting. We're conscious there's a lot of interest from you, so we want to leave enough time for Q&A. And as Mark said, if you flag questions in that Q&A, they'll be fielded during this talk and kind of gathered together in clusters of themes so that we can address those at the end. So in terms of background context of how this group got set up, I mean, obviously we're in the pandemic currently, and the European Commission approached the RDA and asked if we could establish a working group. And this was really to try and respond to the current climate, to promote rapid data sharing, but also because of the way RDA is set up, it is a global forum. We've got members all around the world, and we have ways of working to make sure things are neutral and inclusive and allow participation from various different groups. So we set up a kind of rapid response, a fast track approach to getting things approved. So the case statement has still been raised with TAB and Council, but we've been able to get this done in a matter of weeks. And the working process that we're going to go through to get the results, we're aiming to do this in several weeks rather than working on the usual 12 or 18-month cycle for a working group. So we're using the existing structures of RDA, but we're just trying to fast track things through because of the urgency here. And we have used the RDA forum because we wanted to make sure we had international co-chairs, people from different countries, and also with different expertise. So a couple of our co-chairs have domain expertise, so Anne and Priyanka. And we also have people who are linked into different national or regional open science commons. So work like the EOSC or work like is going on in Canada with the National Data Services. And as I mentioned, this working group falls within the usual RDA structures. So, anyone joining the group signs up to the guiding principles. We want to make sure things are done in the open. So we work in open ways to allow contribution from everybody, and we gain consensus within the group and try to get balance, across all of that different expertise. It is very much a community-driven thing, and anything we deliver will be open and not for profit. So there won't be technological lock-in to anything that comes out of the group. And in case people aren't aware, there is also an RDA code of conduct to make sure that people are safe when they're working in fora. And it's kind of ironic that this is coming up because there have been some inappropriate chats. We're being a little bit Zoom bombed, and that's something that we're dealing with. But if there's unprofessional behavior in any of the groups, we do have a code of conduct and mechanisms for people to report breaches and for us to deal with that, because we do all need a safe space to work in. In terms of the working group that we've set up, there are six co-chairs. So Anne from CNRS and Priyanka are two co-chairs with knowledge of this health domain. And then Mark Leggett, Juan and Ingrid have been involved in various roles in RDA, on TAB and Council. Juan is actually the RDA representative on the EOSC Executive Board. And I'm one of the co-chairs too. I'm involved in EOSC and specifically the FAIR working group there. So we try to bring people with different expertise as co-chairs of this group. And we're really acting as a coordinating forum. We will have involvement in the individual subgroups to try and make sure that we coordinate work across those different areas. But we're very conscious that one of the really critical things is having the domain expertise. So when I hand over to Priyanka, who'll talk through the subgroups, you'll see that we're trying to get moderators who are actively working in each of these individual spaces. So the aims of the working group, which you'll see in the case statement, are really to pull together some practical guidelines on data sharing, picking up on the current climate, the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's really to help stakeholders follow the best practices and maximize the efficiency and impact of their work. So I'll go through and talk about the outputs in a moment, but really we're trying to pull together guidelines that are very practical, that help people identify the key resources, the key standards and tools they should be using, and to really try and give them like a decision tree or something that can point them to the relevant resources in their specific context. We also are working with policymakers, so different funders. We've been liaising with the RDA Funders Forum and also with OECD and other groups. And this is really, again, to help maximize that timely data sharing. So to have an impact on the individual policies. The liaison with OECD so far, they've asked us to do a specific policy brief on this. So that's a way that we can really see the work coming out of this group being leveraged in international fora. So in terms of the working group outputs, as I mentioned, we're trying to develop best practice guidelines. And we're doing this within each subgroup, but also overall. So we will make sure that there's coordination across those different data spaces and the resources that are pulled together. And these guidelines aim to highlight all the key resources, so the key kind of data sets or literature, and also the key standards and tools and repositories, so that when somebody is creating data in that space, they know the relevant standards to use, and they also know how and where to share the data and where to find relevant resources to reuse. And as I mentioned, we want these guidelines to be developed in a way that we can have some kind of decision tree to facilitate the navigation and reuse by different stakeholders. So specifically by research communities, so they can get tailored best practice and pointers for their space. But we're also working with the policymakers, so we'll have specific recommendations for researchers and policymakers to maximize that data sharing. So this is the point where I'll hand over to Priyanka. So you can see the structure that we're working to, the overarching working group, which we're the 6 co-chairs of, and then these 5 subgroups. I don't know if Priyanka's unmuted.
I'm unmuted, Sarah.
Excellent. Okay, so if you want to take over and I'll advance as you go.
Sure, thank you. So as Sarah said, there's an overarching working group that's focusing on these 5 areas. When we also acknowledge that the data is not limited to these 5 areas, but these 5 broad categories or topics are chosen because they play a key role in understanding the pandemic and also the response. I'll quickly go through these groups. So omics studies is giving us insights into the evolution of pathogens, especially SARS-CoV-2 over time and space. The clinical data is giving us insights into the demographics, comorbidities, risk factors, hospital admission data, complications, and the outcomes. The epi data is extremely important because it's giving us an insight into the complex relationship between hosts and the pathogen. It's also giving us an insight into SARS-CoV-2 spread and transmission, and also the mode or method of transmission of SARS-CoV-2. Some people say SARS-CoV-2, I say SARS-CoV-2, I don't know if that makes a difference. And social sciences is essentially everything that we're seeing around us, the economic impact, movement and migration of people, trade, investment, health-seeking practices, isolation and quarantining elements, and the geopolitical context of the pandemic. The 5th category, 5th topic or subgroup is community participation. So here we're looking at mainly the one way of crowdsourcing the data, basically syndromic surveillance that's done through community participation. So there's one syndromic surveillance that's run in Australia. It's called flu tracking. People fill out symptoms. It's like a symptom diary. People fill out their symptoms every week. So that's essentially those subgroups in a nutshell. But like I said, we acknowledge that there are more data sets. So we've identified subgroup moderators. And like Sarah said, these moderators have expertise in these 5 areas. And there's one co-chair assigned to each of those groups. We are looking for moderators for community participation. I think we've got a few email exchanges. Sarah has identified someone, not really sure, I didn't check my email. But yes, so this is what we've done so far. Next slide, please, Sarah. So how these subgroups will run. So the moderators that we've identified will organize the work within their subgroups. They'll schedule calls, do writing, editing teams, and look at materials. There are Google Docs and forms set up for identification of resources and drafts. And we also have a wiki page, which is an index to all these files. The editorial team, we're still discussing, and it's a work in progress. The editorial team will review and edit the documents. And one co-chair is assigned per group to help coordinate across the 5 subgroups. So that answers the first question of how we will ensure that there's cross collaboration across those 5 groups. So we had a Google form where people filled out their details, filled out their expertise, and then the working group members were allocated to subgroups based on their preferences. So the 5 key areas, and then we looked at expertise. So the expertise have now emerged as cross-cutting themes because these themes are common across all those 5 areas. So data sharing, ethics, legal, technology, policy, and data models. And people have also specified what their contribution would be. So writing, editing, commenting, community review, disseminating materials, or they would act as observers. People can change their group if they want to, and they can also join multiple groups. So this is a template that we put up as a guideline. So template for guidelines. So this is the Science Europe, the structure recommendations for data management plans. So the scope, a description of the area, explaining what fields of study are in scope and out of scope. The resources, an annotated list of available resources for the area, guidelines, research resources. And again, it's not restricted to these particular type of research resources. It could be, depending on the area or the subgroup, could be more. And key contacts. And I think the key part is the recommendations, a summary of recommendations, what the data collections look like, documentations, the storage and backup, legal and ethical requirements, what the data sharing looks like, and what it should look like, the long-term preservation strategy, and data management responsibilities and resources. We've got a Google Docs set up as a possible structure of recommendations, and this is again a work in progress and will be reviewed by the co-chairs and the moderators. So this is a template for the resources catalog. So again, this is a work in progress. You can submit the suggestions. So this is what we've proposed. So there's the name of resource. So the ones highlighted in green are mandatory. So the name of the resources is obviously really important. The description, creator and owner. So it could be an overarching body that has put out a resource. It doesn't have to be written by a person. A publication date, the type of resource, the language, URL, persistent identifier, what kind of access is on the resource, if it's open access, or does it have a license associated with it, any other information about the resource, and what relevant subgroup the resources can be allocated to. So again, we acknowledge that there are resources that could be cross-cutting across all these 5 groups. So there could be a set of guidelines, or it could be a data set or a policy or a publication that is actually relevant to all these groups. So you can pick all of those groups. And we've got a link there. That should work, I think. Next slide, please, Sarah. So we're working on a very tight timeline, and this is a tentative timeline. It is an iterative approach. So the approach would be to release the first version as soon as possible, and then there'll be revisions. There'll be a lot of parallel work running, given that we're focusing on multiple subgroups and areas. So the timeline for this week is we are looking at solidification of the group between 7th and 9th of April. Collection of list and resources would be open between 7th and 21st of April, because we can see that this is an emerging space and new resources will keep coming up. So next week, we're looking at the collection of initial text in guidelines and recommendations, and iterative cleaning and updating of resources. In week 3, we're looking at reviewing and revising guidelines and recommendations. And the first release is scheduled on 24th. And there'll be expansion and revision as we go on. Next slide, please, Sarah. So this is, again, proposed ways of working. There'll be folder per subgroup with 2 main shared documents, so or the 5 subgroups that we've seen. So there'll be a Google Doc for guidelines based on the template that's provided, and a Google Sheet for resources catalog with a web form for entry. And the permissions can be defined within each of the subgroups. So we propose that a small editorial team would draft guidelines for each of the group. The initial collection of resources would, so the editorial board, the editorial team would look at the initial collection of resources and ideas, and they will review it. And the subgroup guidelines will be collated by the working group into an overarching guideline. Next slide, please, Sarah. And this is, again, a proposed meeting schedule. So we've tried to schedule it so we can have one group's meeting feed into the other group's meeting and then have a sequence there. So we propose that the working group co-chairs would meet on Monday. The subgroup moderators plus the working group co-chairs would meet on Thursday. And again, this depends on other people's availability. We need to work that out. Individual subgroup meeting can happen anytime during the week. And editorial team meetings in late April to coordinate across guidelines. And we are also proposing that we will provide a weekly update through a webinar, something that we've done today. So the webinars are proposed on this, I think it's the same time. Yep, converting time to myself. So it's the same time as today. So weekly we'll be giving a webinar status update. Next slide, please, Sarah. Right, opening it up for questions now. Are we opening it up for questions, or should I move on to the next slides? We've got 3 more slides.
Yeah, I think probably open up for questions, because the things after this are like a recap. They're just actions for people, like the links to the resources and just summary pages.
Great, excellent. So we'll take questions now then.
Okay, so maybe I'll just cue what's been put in so far, and again would encourage people to enter any questions you have into the Q&A box, because it makes it a little bit easier to see them.
Do you want me to open it up here, Mark, so people can see the Q&A?
Sure.
I don't know if that shows for people.
Well, maybe, you mean to share it on the screen?
Yeah, is it showing on screen? I don't know if it is or not.
No, it won't.
Okay.
It won't share the Q&A.
Oh, will it not? Okay, I've moved it onto the screen that I'm showing, but it's obviously not showing it. Okay.
Oh, Karen.
I can see it as well.
Yeah. Somebody said they can see it. So you go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, okay. Right. Sorry. I just come out of the slide share so that I can turn it off. Anyway, go ahead with the first question while I try and get this to work.
So the first question from Catriona asks, should there be a publisher working group to align COVID data policies, such as data associated with papers? And I'll let both of you, Priyanka and Sarah, decide. I can also open up to the other co-chairs as well.
Mm-hmm. I think would this be a theme? I think this is like a cross-cutting theme, like we discussed other things. So it would be, my understanding is that it would be a theme and guidelines that would fall under that theme.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it seems to be a cross-cutting theme to me too. So I think there's probably a couple of ways to address it. I think there's already a publisher policy working group. I think Ian might be on the call, and I think he's a co-chair of that. So maybe there's like a joint activity with that group to address particularly like publisher policies in this space. But perhaps through the groups, I mean, there will be a collection of resources, and I imagine some of those resources may be, publishers' policies on, how data and papers in this space are shared. So I think it'd be good to link with people who have that publisher expertise.
I'm just going to unmute Catriona. She might have a couple of things to say here.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead, Catriona.
Thanks very much. It's Katrina McCallum. I'm the Director of Open Science at Hindawi. I was formerly at PLOS. And so Ian and I have been talking about this as well. Just there's two things that come to mind. One is that there is going to be an increasingly huge volume of papers with data in various states of ability to share and reuse associated with those papers. And one of the things we're thinking about is trying to find a way to peer review the data sets, at least associated with papers, and in a way screen them up front to try and identify those papers where the data is so valuable. If it's not reusable, how do we make it reusable as soon as possible on the code, and get that out to the community in a state that can be reused? There are a lot of authors who say their data are made publicly available, but sometimes they don't realize it's not, and they don't realize it's not in a state that can be reused by anyone. Mm-hmm. So a sort of clearinghouse to identify, and I can give an example with one paper here, Neil Ferguson's paper that affected youth policy in the UK. He's an epidemiologist at Imperial. His paper was based on code he wrote 14 years ago. That code was not in a state that could be reused by others. Actually, industry came in, including Microsoft and others, to help clean up that code and make it reusable so other researchers could rerun the model with their data based on the same code. And so it's not making all of COVID research data in a state that is reusable, because not all of it will be valuable, but who gets to decide that has to be the community, of course, and of course, including social science in this as well. But I'm just thinking, can these policies include perhaps a sense of how those papers that need special treatment one way or another, or those data sets, even independent of papers, let's forget papers, those data sets that need really special treatment can get that support and the resources, no matter where they come from in the world, to make it reusable, rather than applying a blanket policy guidelines to everything.
Yeah.
Katrina, I'm going to go ahead. We've got a lot more questions here, so I'm going to go ahead and just read them out in the order that they've come in. Kieran asks about the consensus principle in RDA and if that is possible to kind of use that approach in this kind of circumstance, and is it costing us time?
Yeah, I think Juan had a response to this. So Juan, I don't know if you want to unmute and answer. Or Mary?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer this. And this is just a personal view that I've thought of since reading the question, so it's not so deeply considered. Because we're following an iterative approach, I mean, it's a good question. We certainly will not have time to reach a consensus on everything we put forward. But because we're following an iterative approach, I think in the early versions, we could just put both sides of the argument and try and make agreement in later versions.
All right, thanks, Juan. The next question, in the clinical space, IT standards interoperability, is there a link to the EU CEF, eHealth, the DSI, cross-border sharing of medication and patient summary? I don't know if anybody has a quick answer to that one.
Is Anne on the call? Because Anne's probably best placed to answer that.
Anne is on the call. Anne, you can talk if you have a response to that one.
Okay, yes, not yet, but that's part of the resource that will be linked to.
All right, thanks, Anne. Next one, Nick asks if the resource catalog is being populated from existing lists, or is it an entirely new registry, in quotes?
So I mean, we essentially are only just agreeing the structure for this now, and we also need to discuss with the moderators about like how they want things to work. But I think we want to populate from existing lists as much as possible. A couple of us had a call with the EC this morning about guidelines coming out of EMBL and also from the EC itself to their award holders. And those will have recommendations, you know, like, and lists of resources. So we'd certainly be plugging those in, and I think building on what's already out there. So within the groups, it would be really helpful if people know existing things to share them so that we can build off those.
All right, thanks, Sarah. And I also noted Susanna Sanson has mentioned the fair sharing working group to facilitate entry into the platform there. So that's also something we're considering.
Yeah.
Next question is, do you have guideline examples to show what the final products will look like?
So not yet, but this is why we've created the template, and we still need to discuss this with moderators. But we have an idea of how we could structure those guidelines so that we're, you know, addressing the resources, but also the best practice in terms of how you create, document, share data in each of these spaces. But this is like, you know, an iterative process of developing them. So I think that's something that will emerge over the coming weeks.
Mm-hmm. And just jumping over to the chat, because there was a question from Ian earlier, what are the plans for engaging researchers, many of whom may not know of RDA, and generating primary data? Which group members represent this stakeholder group?
Yeah, so I mean, we have a couple of co-chairs, you know, who are active researchers, and this is why we want to make sure the moderators, you know, are from those specific research areas and are plugged in more with researchers, because I think that's critical. I don't know if other co-chairs have, you know, comments around how we'll do the researcher engagement.
I could probably say something
Yeah, sure.
on behalf of the Secretariat. So as the Secretary General, we have plans, of course, to ensure that there's consistent and constant updates of what's going on. And obviously it will be clearer once the resources have started and some of the preliminary outputs come along. We're in contact not just with the researchers, of course, but also with the policymakers and others to try and ensure that this is a valuable and meaningful output, which so we will do some specific activities. Our first step is this one, to get the people engaged, and the next one will be to ensure that these guidelines and recommendations are clearly made aware of and promoted to the correct different stakeholders, of which there is more than just the researchers, but it's a good point.
And next question from Daniel, can we clarify the licensing of the guidelines right away, suggesting CC0?
Yeah, so I completely agree with Daniel. I think we want the licensing as open as possible. But I don't know whether RDA has an official position on that, like how RDA outputs are licensed generally.
Yes, we do. We have two licensing possibilities, and CC0 is fine. And we can agree on that unless there's an objection, but I would let the moderators maybe have an understanding with their groups, because there is a choice in RDA. We have two common Creative Commons licenses that can be applied.
Okay. But yeah, I think that principle of openness, we should, I mean, both are licenses, I guess it's CC0 and CC BY. So we want to keep things open.
Yes.
Now, again, just putting these questions out in the order that I see them coming in, there was a question, if a well-organized group, if the group could ask the Australian PM for anything, what would it be?
I'll take that one.
So we can skip that one if we wish.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's and the Claudia's question was answered. Eva highlights that they're creating a working group to establish RDA guidelines for health research performing organizations to create fair open data policies. So there's a suggestion about intersections with the group and syncing up the efforts. And there is a session under the virtual plenary 15 tomorrow. So
yeah. Yeah, just coming in on Ava's question, I think there's quite a few groups that are doing, work in parallel spaces like the publisher ones or these health groups. So it'd be good to, collaborate across the different RDA groups.
And Natalie's highlighted that as we've noted in our earlier calls, that there are a number of efforts out there, and she gives an example with a link there, COVID-19 Cognitive City, which is a resource repository. So the question is, how can we be informed by other efforts like that?
Yeah, I think this is something that will emerge through the individual, groups. And as people start to contribute resources, we'll find either existing catalogues like that or things we can build on. And I think Claire's question picks up on this as well. I actually like the idea of using Zotero. It may be more versatile than Google Sheets. So as Hilary mentioned at the start, this has been a very kind of like rapid fire group where we've just been trying to set up structures to help people actually contribute in a useful way. So that idea about the resources catalogue, we just tried to pull together a basic structure last night. But I think that's something that, is open for discussion if people, have other ideas or better ways for us to gather that data.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Now there's a question from Bernadette, the caveat about data-driven dashboards and visualizations, and how would the co-chairs and speakers frame that caveat? I'm not 100% sure what the caveat is, but Sarah?
I could probably answer that question. So there are different dashboards that different countries have put together. And the granularity of information on those dashboards is different depending on the privacy requirements and the legislation in those countries. So I feel that at a broad level, I think that would be the difference, how granular the information can be that can be collected and put up on a visualization board, a dashboard.
Okay, thanks, Priyanka. And Natalie asked if there's a metadata standard behind the resource catalog.
Yeah, so we'd essentially worked from the basic data site metadata when we were pulling that together first last night. But there were some things that we added. So we decided that, a resource might be applicable to all 5 groups, and rather than having 5, group catalogs, we should have one, and you just select what your resource is applicable to. But I think it's really important to be using standards and also building off existing catalogs.
Thanks, Sarah. And maybe just Matthew's highlighted that he thinks the subgroups are open to all RDA members, and just to reinforce that is, of course, true. And you can participate in more than one subgroup if that's of interest. So the next one is somebody's working on a recommendation as part of a group of 8 recovery response report this week, and adds in a email contact. So I'm going to leave that message up in the Q&A window for Priyanka and Arina to note that and maybe get in touch with the individual.
Thanks, Mark.
And next question from Joe: is there communication with WHO people, which formatting and what metadata they would need to be streamlined, including sorting by discipline and cross-platform data repository searchability? So I guess getting at the way this will be presented and so it's most useful.
Yeah, so I don't know if Anne wants to speak on that, because I think there was a contact Anne was working with in WHO.
Anne, I think you still have.
Yes, actually I don't have any direct contact yet established and confirmed for the group there.
Okay. Oh, was it UNESCO? Yeah.
Yeah, it was with UNESCO, yeah.
I have a contact with WHO, someone who works in the data side of things and the protocols. So data collection protocols, mainly Epidata. So I can reach out. I think that's one of the plans, that once we dive into the structure and of the documentation and start collecting resources, is to reach out to bodies like WHO.
Next question from Stefan: is there a relation of this work to the work done in the FAIR space of RDA?
Sorry, I'll just jump up so I can read that question.
Sorry, I just...
Oh, did you just remove it? Okay. Yeah, there are various groups that deal with FAIR within RDA, and certainly like the resources that are shared need to be fair and open where possible as well. So we're looking to promote overlaps between groups. So yeah, I would say, I mean, part of the reason I've got involved in this is because I'm dealing with the FAIR stuff for EOS.
And suggestion from Lynn that the group may want to submit an editorial to promote the openness of data to Nature Scientific Data.
Yeah, I would say so. At the moment, we have our plates full with getting these groups set up and starting the guidelines, but I think that'd be a really nice thing to do once we have some guidelines to share, to kind of show, the importance of promoting the openness.
And the next one is asking if we could post the DOIs of the papers we're talking about. So not sure if we've considered that, Sarah or Priyanka, in terms of how we would make some of the material available if it's not in the registry or resource list.
Yeah, so I'm wondering what papers Heinz is referring to there. So if it's about things like our guidelines template document and the resources template, at the moment they're very much in flux. So the structure of them may change depending on the contributions people make. And they're like a initial straw man to help us start to gather resources and recommendations. So I think in terms of a DOI, we wouldn't really want to be assigning a DOI until we have a first draft of the recommendations to put out publicly. But maybe some of those other existing published guidelines, we've asked people to put DOIs in the resource catalogue.
And Eva points out in the chat that since we're creating an RDA working group for RDA guidelines for health research performing organizations, so that link is in the chat as well. Next question, is there an intention to tap into secondary use of clinical data similar to the many registers that we see?
Can I take that one, or
Yeah.
Yeah. I think currently, because we're in this emergency response phase, so there's a particular legislation and an ethical framework under which data is collected in different parts of the world. So I think the idea would be to definitely think about what the secondary usage would look like, because in the future, people would want to do epidemiological studies, look back studies into what happened. So I think it will be interesting to define that, what framework would be like under which it can be used for secondary purposes.
And the next question asks if this is the first time that RDA is developing guidelines for an outbreak such as this. And are there other international research agencies that have the same goal, and how can we ensure that we intersect?
Can I take this one, Mark?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ingrid.
So maybe it's good to mention here that this working group is also set up in the context of what we call the Data Together initiative, which is an initiative where by the RDA will collaborate with the other international data organizations, GoData, the World Data System, and GoFair. So each of those organizations have their own initiatives, but we try to align and synchronize them and keep one another informed and make sure that we don't do double work there. Of course, a stakeholder like the European Commission is involved and dedicated to this, because they were the ones who approached us in the first place. But we have also a very close contact and relationship with the OECD. So we see also the OECD and their outreach to the member states as one of the adopters of the outputs of the working group and the subgroups.
Thanks, Ingrid. Hugh's question highlights that RDA's goal, of course, is to be technology neutral as a platform. But can we note best practices, and gives the example of an NGS or nanopore technologies in omics, or using Docker for running software? Anybody want to try that one?
Could I just clarify the technology neutral issue? I always get asked about it. It's Hilary here. So yes, of course we're technology neutral, but Hugh, your point is right. So we include all the different shall we say, resources and assets available. The point is we don't want technology lock-in, and it's not for profit when it's done in RDA. That's what we mean by that, but that does not stop us listing or pointing to resources that, particularly open ones, but even if not, that could be of value in the particular context. I hope that clarifies.
Thanks, Hilary. James also raises the point of software, and is listing software, I'm assuming is what's meant there, considered in scope for this activity. And he also has a link in there to researchsoft.org.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's really important. So it should come up in the individual groups. And I think, I don't know if you know this, Hilary, or others from RDA, I think there's a new RDA group on software.
At the RESA, I think.
Oh, okay.
RES.
So, yeah, well, that's an affiliate member. So we are just signing an agreement with the Research Software Alliance. So to collaborate together. And there's a group, I think it's a RESA Force 11, something else group on software just being formed too. But clearly, yeah.
And Martin asks, again over to the chat, at which level could national collections of COVID-19 related resources and studies be contributed? And he gives the example of a meta collection activity in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody want to take that one?
Well, it's similar to the question we had before about other large collections and kind of not starting from scratch. Clearly, in our list of resources, we can point to other lists of resources without necessarily copying everything in. and then take those into account when we start writing the recommendations. So I think there'll be a lot of entries in our resource list which are meta entries pointing to other resource lists.
And there was a question to clarify where to submit the resources, but I think, Sarah, are you or Priyanka coming back to that in the final slide?
Yes, but we could
Yes.
actually put the link in the chat or somewhere as well, but it is on the slides as well.
Okay. Question from Daniel, apart from formulating guidelines, do we have any mandate or resources to set up associated infrastructure?
Yeah, so the RDA group itself doesn't have a mandate to set up that infrastructure, but there are parallel initiatives. So within the EOSC context, EMBL is doing EMBL EBI, and I think in collaboration with Elixir, are doing work on a kind of data sharing platform, and we're collaborating with them. So that would be one way to test out the guidelines. But I suspect there are similar initiatives in other contexts as well. I don't know if co-chairs know about other things to flag there.
Anne here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can say that there are activities within Europe in the infrastructure on bioresource and biomolecular resources, BBMRI. So that will be a resource. They are doing their work that can be referenced in our working group, but it is an infrastructure in itself. But flagging to them might be something we can do.
And I know I do want to leave a few minutes for the final set of slides, and we've got a lot more questions. So I just want to highlight that we won't get to all the questions on today's webinar, but we will do our best to respond to them offline or make sure we cover them in next week's webinar. So I think there's Jorgi and a couple of others have similar questions related to joining forces with other initiatives. So I think we've kind of responded to that one in a few different ways. Question about how to best engage researchers from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Any thoughts on that one?
So, I mean, I think this is one of the benefits of having a group of like 400 members, that hopefully people within those groups have useful links into researcher communities, whether it's because they perform a role within an institution like a data steward, or because they're in some kind of advocacy body that reaches out to researchers, or in some learned society. So really, that's a place where all of you as members could help us out. Because as we said earlier, I think it's really critical that we actually engage researchers in developing the guidelines, but also have good ways to disseminate those guidelines out to them and make sure that the guidelines are practical enough and useful enough for them to actually implement.
And I would just highlight that Bernadette has provided an additional kind of clarification on the caveat piece of an earlier question. So I would just direct people to her explanation there. Any thoughts on automatic interfacing with clinical systems? I suspect that's not something that this group would really consider, but putting it out there in case somebody wants to respond. Sorry, I'm just trying to pull out the question. There's a lot of
yeah, there's some links and stuff as well.
So a lot of helpful suggestions coming in through both Q&A and chat. And I see Martin has a question. Oh, okay, that was the one related to national level collections. I think we've responded to that one. Stefan has put in a link. Also mention again of the fair sharing registry. So, and Susanna highlights that we should look at a better way to link these efforts with that. So that's something that we've certainly talked about. Sarah, did you want to say any more on that?
No, just really to flag to people that, yeah, this is all kind of like work in progress. So I'm virtually certain that what we've pulled together as a first kind of straw man is not the best way to collect things. So we definitely are open to suggestions on the structure, but also for certain resources like fair sharing, maybe what we should be looking at is some kind of like API integration so that the resources could be fed in. You know, we don't expect people to have a manual approach of copying things over.
And I would note in the chat again, there's a message from Calvin about working with the commercial sector. And the question of is there, who should he, in this particular case, obviously get in touch with in order to discuss potential roles we can play from the commercial sector?
Yeah, I think with the co-chairs initially and with Hillary too. So we have had another approach. I'm trying to remember who that was from. But I think, you know, there's a lot of expertise and potential things that you could do. So I think if you reach out to the co-chairs, then that's something we can discuss and see where we can best apply the effort.
So a lot of additional helpful comments and links in the Q&A. So I'm thinking maybe it might be a good time to share the slide deck again.
Yeah, sure. So let me just pull that back up. And I'll also minimize these things so that they don't block it. So essentially what we'd wanted to do to close out is just to provide all the links again. I'm pretty sure the question came up about where all the slides are, and that's been put in the chat. So hopefully you have the link, but we will be making the slides available and also this recording. But just to close out, we wanted to flag the key actions for you. So we've made this resources catalogue available. As I said, it's work in progress. You can still comment on the structure and we can think about better ways to gather the information. But we were conscious we've got a lot of members and we've got a lot of interest to actually do something concrete. So we wanted to make it possible for you to submit resources to that catalogue now. You can also provide suggestions on the recommendations template, so the structure for the guidelines. We still need to discuss that with the moderators because the moderators are still being agreed at the moment. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to click advance there. I'll just go back. I was trying to move the menu bar off there. But that will be agreed in the coming days. Make sure you're signed up to the main umbrella group. That's where all the major notifications will go. And as we've said, there are these 5 subgroups, so you can join up to whichever ones are most relevant for your expertise. And the very final slides are just to talk you through those subgroups and to make sure you have all of the links for the different moderators and the kind of co-chair who's working within each group. And Hillary's pulled together these really useful slides that give you all the links to the main web pages, the case statement, and the details like the emails and stuff for those individual groups. So I'll just very quickly show through this, the clinical group, the epidemiology group, which Priyanka's the link into that group, the omics, which we have a couple of moderators for, Rob Hoft and Natalie Myers. And then the Ingrid Diller is going to be coordinating with Irina and Amy on the social subgroup. And then the final one will be myself from the co-chairs. I've already reached out to one person as moderator, but if you're working in this space or you know people who potentially could be interested, please do get in touch with us and let us know so we can get the final few moderators set up. So that's all we had to say. We should have ended on a big thank you slide. But I don't know if there's anything else we want to pick up on just now in the last few minutes.
Maybe just to reiterate again, Sarah, as you said, thanks to everybody for joining not just the webinar, but also the groups. The activity will get underway today. As you saw from the presentation, there's an opportunity now to make suggestions on the simple data model that's being used via a Google form to collect resources, and the moderators and the members of the 5 groups will continue to move things ahead. You also saw a meeting slide where the various groups and co-chairs with moderators, etc., will touch base weekly to make sure we're on top of things and that any issues and questions are responded to. As I said, this webinar recording and the slides, the link to the slides will be communicated again more broadly, but of course it's been duplicated in the chat a couple of times. And I will also make sure that the chat and Q&A, since we weren't able to get to everything, which includes a lot of really great suggestions, I'll make sure that those are part of the notes and for each of the appropriate groups. And also just to reiterate again, from my perspective, and then I'll ask Hillary and any of the other co-chairs if they want to add something before we close, to encourage you to participate in whatever capacity you feel you can add value, and we're happy to have everybody involved. It's a great effort. Hillary or any of the other co-chairs, did you want to respond or say any closing remarks?
And I just wanted to say that some of the questions were directed more specifically to some subgroups. So it might be that the questions come actually from the subgroup start of the work.
I would just like to say that we've tried to capture the questions in both the chat and the Q&A and jot down some. I think it would be useful if we had to make a frequently asked questions available, and try maybe if we're able to answer some of those questions that we didn't get around to today. If everyone's happy with that, we'll do that over the next few days. But the slides are online. I ask you to go and look at them because you get all the links in the slides if you can. They're already available publicly on the website on the landing page of the COVID-19 Working Group.
Thanks, Hillary.
Thank you.
All right, and with that, we're just a few seconds away from the top of the hour, and I know it's busy time. So I would again like to thank everybody for participating, and to Sarah and Priyanka and other members from the co-chairs group for responding to questions in the chat and Q&A. And we look forward to seeing everybody again next week.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.